Good afternoon, good afternoon again, folks. Welcome to another episode of Spilling Tea. I'm your host, Tiffany Daniels. We're going back to that horrible world known as the JRC, but before we do, the usual disclaimers. If you are unfamiliar with the Stop the Shocks campaign or the campaign against the troubled teen industry, you're going to find all the pertinent links right there in the description box. Please, in particular, take note of the article written by NeuroClastic, a small non for profit started by autistics for autistics. In it, they interviewed over 900 ABA professionals in regards to the JRC's so called behavior modification program. The Judge Rotenberg Educational Center doesn't want you to read that article so much. They threatened NeuroClastic with a defamation lawsuit if they did not remove it from the website. NeuroClastic refused, so folks, you know the drill. Please read the article, share it on all your social media. Also included is NeuroClastic's public statement regards to the defamation lawsuit threat, as well as a link to their GoFundMe. We are crowdfunding just in case the JRC actually does see through with their threat. Trigger warning 1. When we discuss places like the Judge Rotenberg Educational Center or Agape Boarding School for Boys, you're going to hear vivid descriptions of and catch clips of surveillance footage of people with mental health issues and disabled people being tortured and abused. If you got young children present, folks, please make sure to go ahead and utilize those headphones, all right? Trigger warning number 2. This channel is marked not for kids for a reason. We use profanity on occasion and speak on dark subjects. If your child is 16 and younger and they are watching this, very obviously parental supervision is very much advised, alright? Okay, so where we left off last time. In an apparent attempt to alleviate concerns relating to psychological risks from a painful shock, the commenter elsewhere states that the electrical stimulation is easily measured objectively and implies that a psychologically harmless level can be set. You are batshit insane if you believe that. Okay? This is what I was talking about in that previous video, where we just don't think that we are hurting them enough for you to be able to say that it could lead to PTSD. I'm their parent and I know them, so I know that when they're shocking them just below the lethal limit, it couldn't possibly hurt them enough to cause PTSD. This is not how PTSD works, folks. Okay? You don't have to have something be considered traumatic enough. All right? That is one of the things we've learned over the last few decades in regards to PTSD. In the beginning, it used to be called shell shock, and it was done in reference in particular to those soldiers who were dealing with the symptoms of PTSD after World War II. As the decades went on, we noticed that several of the symptoms that we were seeing in regards to those shoulders that suffered from shell shock, that the woman coming out of an abusive DV situation, or men coming out of a DV situation, or children coming out of that type of environment, produced the exact same symptomology as the shell shock soldier exhibits. So we began to expand over time in regards to the things that cause PTSD. And one of the things you should note is glaringly missing from the DSM 5 and even from the DSM 4 criteria in regards to that particular diagnosis is nowhere at any point in time does it say that how much physical damage it caused the person would determine whether or not they had PTSD. That's not literally how any of this works. Nor does it talk to the psychological fucking terror of those of us who survived as children and the way it haunts us later and we're still exhibiting years and years later. that symptomology of PTSD, because the quote unquote severity is not the point. The fact that it happened in the first goddamn place and no one did a goddamn thing to stop it, and those of us who are trying to stop it are being constantly vilified and ran down in the press. You see where I'm going with this, folks. When it comes to psychological things, literally the never ending constant threat of fear is more than enough to cause psychological issues down the line. To say anything else is to be deaf, dumb, and blind to everything that's going around you, okay? It is a literal misreading in regards to the diagnosis of PTSD, because you want to save your pet sadist so that you don't have to actually become a parent and do your goddamn job. I'm sorry, I'm going to say it. I know of the parents before you start with I don't understand, like I've never seen the bars on the windows, the grievous self-injurious behavior. I worked in the field as well as being autistic. Two things, folks. One thing, I was that goddamn child. And I've also worked with that child in the field. Okay? There is no such thing that if I just. There's no. How can I put this? I'm at a loss of words. To receive a diagnosis of PTSD, there's not a pain threshold on it, folks. There's not a pain threshold on it. I barely tapped you in my own estimation. So obviously, even with that threat of fear constantly hanging over you until the day you die, and that sense of never truly really being safe anywhere that lingers on long after the abuse is ended, and you're going to sit there and tell me, well, they didn't hit you hard enough, so you just don't have PTSD, is the most ridiculous and infuriating argument that I've ever seen. And the fact that I know that this actually came from a parent makes me that much more livid. Because that person shouldn't be in charge of a goddamn snail's existence. But let's go on and read, shall we? First, as discussed earlier, due to the complexity of the interactions between different output settings, pulse width, frequency, electrode size, and inter-individual variability in shock perception, it is difficult to define a cutoff stimulation for pain or trauma. Again, I argue, and I've been backed up by the studies, that literally just having that constant fear and terror of possibly being vulnerable to more attacks does more psychological damage than I could ever possibly put into words for you. Okay? In fact, it's that terror that lives in us long after the threat of physical violence is no longer there. The panel understood this and was very concerned about the impact this variability could have. There is no variability. You are shocking the shit out of a child at just below the lethal limit because of how they were born. Okay? Because we just weren't faking being neurotypical good enough for you that particular day. Okay? There doesn't need to be variability. You live under that kind of threat and that hellhole, you're going to probably end up with PTSD. This idea that they're trying to argue that the pain just wasn't enough to cause PTSD, this is the shit that makes me rabid. I won't say what I would like to do because I would probably never be able to make a YouTube video again. Most importantly, individuals who are subject to ESDs are repeatedly exposed to a painful stimulus, and several individuals have expressed that they were anxious and or fearful about future shocks. Thank you. Further, because of the dose-response relationship between trauma and the severity of resulting psychological symptoms is weak, it would be even more difficult to use electrical parameters to predict whether any eventual psychological symptoms will be mild or non-existent, and the FDA is unaware of data demonstrating such. This is one of the things that have pissed me off in current medical practice, this idea of severity. Whether you're going to have more severe PTSD or another. Here's the thing, folks, just like the so called autism spectrum, it's fucking fluid. Let me give you an example from my own life. I am fine a good majority of the time. The same mouthy, foul mouthed, very strongly opinionated girl you've all come to know through this channel, right? Those days you would consider my PTSD to be extremely mild. There are other days, and all it takes is a simple scene. I can remember of an exact one. I was watching Law and Order Special Victims. It was in regards in particular to a teenage girl who was not just essayed by her dad, but encouraged others to do the same with her to produce children for the family. That particular episode, there was a scene in it that hit me so hard I lost complete ability to be able to function. I went on full on flashback mode for hours on end. And my particular form of PTSD, when those flashbacks happen, sometimes cellular memory will reproduce some of the injuries in regards to whatever particular memory got triggered. Okay? I can't handle sudden loud noises. Not very well, anyway. I mask like hell, but everybody who knows me can tell. Things that trigger me, and I go from being the person that you all know to a timid, frightened, and caving in on herself woman in 0 to 60. As with most forms of health, mental or otherwise, it doesn't say at the same intensity all the time, every moment of the day. Okay? So, this idea, well, you might have a more mild form of PTSD, but because you can function. Let me tell you about the days I can't. All right? It's getting annoying. PTSD is PTSD. It fluctuates and changes with how we deal with it every day regards to the environmental triggers that we face every day. You see where I'm going with this here, right? So I'm sorry, that part really annoys me. That also being said here, to say we cannot scientifically measure such a thing is accurate. We don't exactly have an electrical pulse on just how terrified I would happen to be if my abuser was in the room with me. Fair enough. Okay? When it comes to PTSD, severity doesn't matter. It is the violence and the threat of violence. Okay? It has nothing to do with just how much of a level of pain has been inflicted, as much as it has to do that pain was inflicted in the first place. And now I have that Damocles sword hanging around my neck for the rest of my life, wondering and kind of sickly waiting for the next one. Right? I kind of want to make this point because these parents want to argue another point, that what's going on is very obviously treatment, and although it seems unsavory for us, it's actually saving their lives, and they're not actually being caused enough pain that can lead to psychological issues later. Sounds reasonable on the surface. But then you take a look at that Andre McCollins video, and we take what we know in this decade in regards to PTSD, and it rips their arguments into tiny bitty shreds. Okay? Let's go, kid. Regardless of the ability to draw such a line, the GED devices currently in use pose all of the physical and psychological risks discussed in this rule. Exactly. We know this from facts and evidence. And the fact that some of these arguments the JRC is trying to use are very old and haven't just been used in regards to keeping disabled kids in horrific abusive situations, but even neurotypical kids. Go watch on Quiet on Set if you don't believe me. It's the same arguments, folks. Yeah. We can definitively say with logic, without even having to look at all the data, that if you go through some traumatic shit, you're going to have some psychological issues later on while you're trying to come to grips with what happened to you. Okay? It doesn't have to be painful enough. The way that boils my blood. We're going to close on that, folks. We don't get very many views on this channel. The few that we do tend to get removed from time to time. So, folks, if you could, please don't forget to hit the like button, hit subscribe. Don't forget to hit the comments. I appreciate your time. As always, folks, we here at Spilling Tea do hope you have a good one. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye, everyone.